second to last issue.
Sure.
Guns.
Yes.
I'm a gun owner, and my friends make fun of me because I have a safety on my gun. They make fun of me because they call me a trigger snob because I like a very good trigger. Some of my friends, as you understand, your policy is a ban on assault weapons and no buyback. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Convince me or convince my friends saying that they shouldn't have the right to have an assault weapon.
I mean, it's just like you don't have the right to go into a crowded movie theater and yell fire, and yet and still you have something called the First Amendment. Am I right?
Yes.
And what we have to do is make sure that there are adequate protections. Okay. It's not stripping anybody of their Second Amendment right to own a gun. Okay. The question is, what can we do to make sure that the most amount of people can remain safe and still balance that interest of your right? And so just like you can't go into that crowded movie theater, somebody should say, I should be able to go into the crowded movie theater and scream fire. But you can't. There are some parameters. There are limitations.
You can, but you're going to get
and when there are parameters everywhere we go. Airport security. Just thinking about ways in which, in certain contexts, there are limitations. That doesn't mean you don't have a Second Amendment right. That just means you don't need that type of weapon out on the streets to inflict the type of harm that those weapons are typically used for. And that's the kind of concept that this is about. It's not about not having a gun. You can't have, a rifle. You can't have any type of weapon. It's just a matter of making sure we see certain trends, making sure that we are creating a body of laws that are respectful of everybody's rights. And I also have a right to be safe, and I also have a right not to be subject to mass shootings. I also have a right to also make sure that there are not undue or unnecessary violence on our streets, particularly in places of common use. So we have to respect each other, and it's not to suggest you can't be a gun owner. What I would hope is that everybody who owns a gun is a responsible gun owner, properly cleans their guns, locks them up when appropriate, all of those things. That's respecting the society in which we live. Why do you lock a gun? Not to hide it necessarily from yourself. What if somebody robs your house?
That's right.
There are things that happen, and when that gun's out on the street, there's damage that's caused. And I also say this, we also have to be more vigilant about the broad spectrum of gun violence. And so when I say that, we've got 80 to 90% of Americans who want to close the gun show loopholes and actually want to have background checks. Why should we be opposed to background checks in terms of owning with respect to gun ownership? When you think about to drive an Uber, you got to be fingerprinted. Lots of things, we have safety mechanisms in place to make sure that our society as a whole is safe. And those are the things that I want to make sure we're safeguarding. When I was in high school, Columbine happened. Sadly, we are almost in this very same spot as we were back then in terms of where we've gotten with sensible gun policies. So again, I'm not interested in starting a conversation about mandatory buybacks because I don't think that's where we're going to find consensus. I'm interested in us finding consensus on some of the common sense things that we can do to keep our communities safe.
You're going to have a big fight against you.
Yes.
It's going to be a hard fight.
Yes. Well, I'm ready for the fight. We've got John Cornyn, who's in office. He's got an A+ rating with the NRA. Yes. And what I also say to that is, yes, he may have an A+ rating from the NRA, and I've made some good grades in my life, but an A+ from the NRA won't be one. And they do not want, like even the Violence Against Women's Act. He has voted, or he has not been supportive of that because the NRA doesn't like one of the provisions in the act. These are things that we can't lose sight of. It doesn't mean you can't own a gun. It doesn't mean that you can't, have your Second Amendment rights protected. But it's kind of like when I'll give you another example. And I got some challenge on this. When Hurricane Harvey happened and we had 51 inches of rainfall in my community, billions of dollars in losses, so much so that we were the second worst costly storm in U.S. history. Okay? Lives were lost. And yet and still, I had pressure on me not to change our regulatory paradigm for how we build in floodplains. Think about that. You're always going to be faced with pressure because you're never going to be able to make everybody happy, but you can't ignore the realities of the circumstances you're faced with. And that's what I'm responding to, is the reality of the circumstances we're faced with. We don't just have mass shootings either. We also have gun violence by suicide. We have gun violence by homicide. I've had a murder in my own family in terms of gun violence. And it isn't a mass shooting example, but my point to you is that we've got to be vigilant about who's got guns, make sure that we're protecting ourselves as best we can. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting a regulatory paradigm that keeps people safe and respects the access to rights that people do have.